everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I will be showing you a little bit of the video that I did for Patreon this month. And so if you want to see the full walkthrough for this, the link to it will be in the description. The main thing that I want to focus on in this one is the negative painting aspect of the process. It's one of my absolute favorite things to do with watercolors, and I also think it's the best showcase of what watercolors can do. This one was actually inspired by one of my favorite watercolor videos, which is one by Payne. So when you look at that painting and this one, the inspiration will be very clear. And that's because when my patrons chose this reference photo for me to paint, I immediately thought of that one. It was one of the paintings that really inspired me to try with watercolors, and it was also one of the paintings that inspired me to get my first watercolors, which were my Sakura Koi watercolors. So that video is very influential to me, and this one is going to be a little tribute to that. But I think the very main difference is going to be the watercolors that I chose. We're gonna talk about that later on. So negative painting is when you paint around a subject instead of painting the actual subject itself. Usually it's more a play on values where you have very dark colors around a light object, and therefore it brings the shape of the object out. What I love about doing that with watercolors is that even when you repeat the process multiple times on top of each other, you're still gonna see the very first layers, sometimes even in the darkest values. It's the transparency of the medium just makes it work that way, and I just think it's so fun to do. So you see it at work on this painting. I started with my brightest colors first, and they're actually in contrast to the greens that I will choose later on, but that's by design. I really want these bright colors to pop beside the dark greens that I will be layering on top of them. So then after I've had that main color on, the next thing that I did was just choose the brightest leaves that I see in the reference photo and then paint around those. And once I've done that, I will be repeating the same process until I've finished the piece. And you can see what's so great about the watercolors is that even though it might at first seem like the first layer is only visible on the brightest of leaves, but they actually add a lot to the layers that we add later on too. I think that those dark greens are going to look a lot different when on top of the bright reds and yellows versus what it would have looked like if I just painted that directly on the plain paper. And even if it was just the darker layers on top of each other, I wouldn't have been able to get those darker values in one pass. It still would have needed multiple layers to achieve the same value that I needed for the background. So this process is just so great to do with watercolors. And I also think it's beginner friendly. And that's why I was inspired so much by Payne's video, is that I think it teaches you a lot about watercolors while also being a fun, not that complicated way to do that. And in the same way that her video inspired me to start watercolors, I hope that this one also inspires one of you guys to finally start watercolors too. So for this one, I also want to give out tips for doing negative painting, and I actually learned them in this painting, even though I've already grasped the concept, and it's also something that I've done multiple times before. There were still things that I learned in making this painting, and I want to share them to you guys. So the first one is always to make sure that your layer is completely dry before you go over it with another layer. Even when you start painting just on damp paper, there's going to be a lot of feathering to your brush strokes, and you don't want that. The key in this painting is to have just as precise and crisp edges as possible. So you really want to make sure that your layers are dry in between before you start another one. Another tip for people who aren't used to working with floppy, sort of softer brushes is to use the ones that you're most comfortable with. So I'm the kind of artist that likes more control of my paintings, so I actually prefer to use stiffer brushes. So ones like my Princeton Snap, and really even just any synthetic watercolor brushes. And you can see on this one, I actually started with my softer ones. And that one was one of my first mistakes with this painting, especially in the first layers. I wasn't that concerned about the shapes that my brushstrokes were making. I think I was more used to painting portraits where I'm more free with my shapes. With this one, it's a little bit more precise. Even though it looks more simple than my portrait paintings, it actually requires a lot of precision in between the layers. So that one was one of my first mistakes, is that I didn't use my precise brushes to paint these layers. And so there are leaves, especially on the first and second layers, where I just didn't really shape them out that well. And that was one of my biggest regrets. But if you're used to painting with your softer brushes and can get precise lines with them, then go ahead and do that. This advice is more catered to someone who works like I do. So my third tip would be to not be too scared of playing around with textures and different colors in the same layer. Like on this one, even when I'm just blocking out one layer, I would start with a different colored green and end in a completely different one. So you can have variations in color within the same layer, just as long as you mostly keep it in the same value. You can also even play around with different textures in one layer. Just make sure that you're not letting your layers dry in patches of different values. So if you're blocking out a whole layer, you can play around with how the watercolors spread out within that layer, and you can play around with different techniques to get different textures within that layer too. Just make sure that your watercolors aren't drying in different patches, so you mostly just want to keep them uniform in values within one layer. Make sure that you don't have any dark patches if you're just working on your first or second layer, because it's going to look completely different when you want to add those darker layers after that. So for my last tip, this may be a little bit more complicated, but I do recommend using very transparent watercolors for this, and usually that goes with more professional paints, and that's why there's a little bit of caveat to that, where I would just say to use professional paints for this, because usually they're not that chalky. But I obviously haven't tried all brands before. Just make sure that your paints aren't very chalky, because you're gonna have a lot of buildup in between, and as you move on to adding more layers, it's gonna be very difficult to do that. It almost might start feeling like gouache, and that's gonna make this whole process hard. So if you can, use professional paints when you do this. Obviously, Pear Fleur didn't use professional watercolors, so I think that speaks a lot to her skill and how much control she has of her water. But if you're new to watercolors and this is your first try painting with them, just keep in mind that those are going to be some of the problems that you could run into, and that it's one of the things in art where your art supplies are going to matter, and you shouldn't beat yourself up if you're running into trouble when you're painting with them. So my last tip in doing negative painting is actually for after you've done the whole piece in that technique. So after you've done that work and after all of your layers are in there, make sure that when you add different details to your subjects, like for me, I had to add in some of the veins on the leaves. Really make sure that when you're doing that, you're also still overall you're still maintaining it in its same value. So if you want to add different textures and different details within your leaves, make sure that you're working with very loose paint and with lots of water, so that your darker ones won't push itself to the back and will still remain in the same value in this sort of hierarchy that you put in for your painting. So that is it mostly for the tips that I have for doing negative painting with watercolors. I really enjoyed painting this piece, and you can see I've kept the girl in the foreground very simplistic, and I've also chosen to use colors that I initially used for the very first layer in my background. So even though I want that kind of separation between the two, I still wanted there to be a link that connects them together and makes the whole piece more cohesive. So in a lot of ways, this painting is actually completely different to my usual works, where in painting portraits, I'm actually so used to not needing this kind of precision, especially initially in the first few layers. I would usually try to have a lot of fun with how the colors are sitting on my portraits in the first layers, and then slowly move on to becoming more precise as I add more and more layers to it. With this one, straight from the get-go, as soon as I'm done with the first layers, I immediately needed to be careful in how I was laying my layers, because they are sort of what shapes out the leaves that I'm painting. So there isn't that kind of progression in the kind of precision that I need when doing negative painting. It's almost sort of opposite, because you start being very precise with your layers, and then as you move on, you can start to improvise with how the darkest shadows are doing. At least that's what I did with this painting. Towards the end, I actually just added whatever kind of shadows that I needed to make the shapes that I want. That was a time when I started to deviate from what I had in my initial line work. So even though this painting looks a little bit different from my usual works, I had the most fun with this one. Maybe in the sense that it was a break from my usual works, but I had so much fun with this painting, and I hope you guys have fun painting it too if you do want to try it out. And again, if you want to recreate it with the full walkthrough, I will have the link to it in the description. And that is it for this one. Thank you guys for watching, and I will be seeing you guys again soon.